Dear colleagues, good morning. We have a very interesting joint session on zero emission and ecological factor as a new matrix for transport policy. My name is Maxim Leksutov. I am the Deputy Mayor of Moscow for transport. And today I would like to introduce Victoria Bityukova. She's the Doctor of Geography, Professor of Geography Faculty of Moscow State University. Igor Antarov, the Managing Partner, Moscow Tesla Club. Stefan Knopfer, the Senior Partner, McKinsey & Company, Stamford. Jessica Woolward, she's going to join us pretty soon. She's the Director for Energy and Sustainable Development, the Transportation Department of New York, the USA, and Salvador Ruedo. He is the Director of the Agency for Urban Ecology, Barcelona. As we do realize, we all depend on the environmental situation in the town. Not always people tend to understand what is going on around and what is the ecological situation in the city. But sooner or later, they come across certain problems which are related to the personal health status. And we start looking for causes of that phenomena, and actually we do it pretty late. And so I would like to give the floor to every panelist here, and so that they present their vision as to what we do mean by the sustainability of transportation policy. And we have quite a number of colleagues staying with us in Moscow, so we are interested in the Moscow reality, and please share your expertise and knowledge on the subject. And after short presentations, we will discuss it in more detail and probably take some questions from the audience and discuss some other prepared questions. Victoria Bityukova, the floor is yours, and you wrote about the pollution of air via transportation facilities in Moscow. This was a really eye-opener for me, and one of the premises says that one of the key deficiencies of Moscow is the specific location of the central part of Moscow, and where all the roads are brought together. And so what needs to be done in order to address this challenge, in order to make our city more clean and environmentally friendly? And I would like to get started from the announcement of our section that transport is the key source of pollution in the post-industrial cities and towns. That is absolutely true. And if we have a look at the map of the country and have 112 industrial cities and towns of Russia and show the emissions level, and so the darkest one presents the situation with the contamination and pollution, and the industry is the key source for emissions, and of course the transportation sector plays a predominant role in such cities as Moscow as opposed to minor cities of Russia. And I would like to say a few words as to how to minimize the emissions, what should be the topology of transportation network, and what should be the spatial infrastructure of our cities and towns. And if you have a look at the upper chart, you will see the density of air emissions. And the better and the engine is optimized, so the lower is the emission by 1/3 approximately. I may give you such statistics that when the reconstruction of MCAD took place, so the emissions lowered down by 3 times, as if Kapotnya refinery, 3 Kapotnya refineries were closed. And the most positive shift was made over the past few years, when all the roads were constructed real fast, and we have this corridor highways, but just recently those projects have been implemented and therefore mitigating the air emissions. But we have more and more cars to come to Moscow, but the emissions are lowered. In addition to the density of the transport network and its connectivity, we have another thing to mention, the barriers or obstacles which occur in the urban area. In 2000s, the first barrier for the higher density of emissions was registered in specific streets of various cities and towns indicated here. And I made some kind of an overall report, and the central part of the downtown area had this concentration. And so by 40% this concentration was registered, but little by little this situation has been changing due to the new strategy of cities and towns, more adequate behavior of the drivers, so some limitations to the accessibility of certain vehicles. So a number of processes changed this situation, and the key barrier in major cities and towns are industrial zones, especially if they are really lengthy ones, and they have more than 40% of density of emissions. As to our latest survey of industrial zones of Moscow, so far, only Kapotnya, the oil refinery, still has this hazardous risks, but other industrial zones are pretty balanced. The second place is taken by railroads. Railroads tend to be barriers, and around them we have the higher density of emissions. And by the way, railroads tend to be connected with the industrial zones, and so they actually have this hotbed for emissions. As to the historical center, I should say that several cities and towns already got rid of such high level of emissions and pollutants. It's also worthy to mention that rivers become just a barrier for cars and other vehicles to get access to the cities and towns. But Moscow presents a problem here, but Nizhny Novgorod, Irkutsk and Khabarovsk have even worse situation. But in Moscow, we already addressed this challenge to a large extent. Paradoxically, as it might seem, but green belts or green zones may be also those barriers or these areas for actually collecting certain hazardous emissions. Of course, we do not have to eliminate those green zones, no, but we have to speak about the diversity, the diversified nature of this situation. And in order to present a solid solution as how to deal with certain problems and how to address challenges with transportation, we have to take into account also the quality of fuel control the quality of engine, but the planning measures may, by the way, contribute a lot onto mitigating several emissions. But they have to be applied, all these measures, on a very rational way. For the central part, it should be one strategy. For the suburbs, it should be another strategy. Also, roads construction is to be provided in a balanced way, and there should be also some balance between mid-sized cities, small-sized cities, and large-sized cities, but not with the detriment of the transport mobility of the cities and towns. So, again, balance is a top priority for us in the final decision-making. Victoria, thank you so much. I would like to put two questions to you, maybe afterwards, after all the speakers have a say. And my questions will be of the following type. How do you view the ideal city? Proceeding from the fact that it should be the city for citizens of Moscow, and what should be the recipe? And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Stefan Knupper, the senior partner of McKinsey Company, Stamford. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me here. I would like to very quickly talk about, if we go to the first slide. I'm not sure, how do I move this? Oh. Thank you. So I can move it myself. So I think for me, I think that it's important to look at this, that this actually is a global topic, and most of the cities in the world, most large cities in the world have very similar problems. So if you think about that, more than 50% of the world population will live in cities, that about 80% of the global GDP will be in cities, and 70% of the global greenhouse gas emission will be in cities. Focusing on cities is actually absolutely important. Following this logic, we as McKinsey have partnered with an organization called C40. C40 was founded by the former mayor of New York City, Mr. Bloomberg, with the idea that global cities face similar problems. Global cities should not compete with each other, but honestly, they should work with each other and learn from each other. So we liked the idea, and C40 has at this point something like 90 plus global cities. It has about 600 million inhabitants. It's about 25% of world GDP. So when you work with those cities, you have a very good overview with what global cities are doing. And the idea was that C40 with the partnering city had developed something what they call Deadline 2020, which means by 2050, those cities should be carbon neutral. So we as McKinsey looked at this analysis and said, what will it take for those cities to be carbon neutral? And then very quickly we realized, as one of those concepts, which I think is important for all the cities to understand, there were about 450 ideas that people came up with what individual cities should do. Now, if you talk as top management and you talk to private companies and your CEO would tell you that he has 450 ideas, you would probably tell him that he's boiling the ocean and he's not focused, he doesn't know what he's doing. Now, in a city environment, this is even more complicated. So therefore, what we said is, what are the most important? So we came down to 12 ideas that actually would make a significant difference for cities. And then actually with those 12 ideas, we were about 67% of the target that we needed to go there. We then compared those 12 ideas with best practices that we have seen across the world with existing technology and said, if every city in the world would just copy and paste this best practice, where would we end up? And therefore, with 12 ideas in 4 categories, you can achieve pretty much the targets. And I think that's a big difference. Don't try to go after 450 ideas. Try to focus what are the ones that are really important, also from your investment. And the other thing is try to learn best practice from other cities, because cities are not competing. Now, the areas that we had, the 12, are listed here. They are relatively simple because they are categorized in 4 areas: Most of them are not new. Decarbonization of the grid. It's either centralized renewables or distributed renewables. It's optimizing energy in buildings, also something that is not new but makes a big difference. At the bottom, it's waste management, and in the middle, it's the next generation mobility. I'm going to double click on the next generation mobility because it has an impact somewhere between 20 to 45%, depending what the starting point is of each individual city. But if you double click here, because that's kind of the new kid around the clock, around the block, decarbonizing the actual grid, everybody knows. Energy use in buildings, people know. Next generation mobility is something relatively new. Now, if you talk about all the levers on the mobility side, you pretty much talk about 4 categories. Number one, the transit-oriented development. It is a good idea if you build very dense cities. Dense cities means people have everything at their fingertips. They don't have to move a lot. They don't have can walk a lot. They can use bicycles. It's actually also healthy for people kind of to move. So that's one thing. The second thing is obviously the combination between mass transit, walking, cycling. All of this is actually very good. To be quite honest, this is something that most cities of the world already executing. There is almost no city that doesn't have a bicycle program or actually try to have walking areas or improves their mass transit system. Now, the interesting piece is actually a new area is the next generation vehicles and the commercial vehicles and the commercial freight, because this is moving really quickly. Very quickly, the old system that we have, look at the car, is actually 100 years old and it's really, really bad. The only reason why we're accepting it, because we are used to it. Cars are parked 96% of the time. If you think about a capital investment, you use it about 4% of the time. That's probably not a very good use of your money. Second, if you drive your car, you have about 86% for fuel. Actually, 86% of your energy reaches the wheels. Everything else, engine losses, idling, is primarily going into heat, nothing else. So it's not a very good system. The next thing is 95% of fatal accidents where people die in a car accident are driver errors. Now, out of those 95% is about 30% drunk driving, about 30% that people are distracted, which means a machine wouldn't do this. The other thing is, if I make a driving error, I hopefully learn that next time I'm driving more careful. Nobody else learns. In a machine, everybody who is in the system is going to learn. And the last one, which for me is actually most shocking, is about 50% of cities' land area is dedicated to streets, roads, parking lots, service stations. We're all used to this. We think this is normal. But think about real estate in a city, how expensive it is. 50% is everything is dedicated kind of to driving. And we use it about 5% of the time as a peak time. The rest of the time, we have obviously road capacity available. So it's another waste. And therefore, any city planner who right now thinks about building more roads is probably not kind of considering the new technology that we have. Here's actually the good news. There are 4 individual trends in the mobility area that each of them is very, very powerful. In a combination in an urban environment, it's probably the biggest revolution that I have seen in my 25 years in automotive and obviously 100 years in automotive. Number one, if you start connectivity, it's your cell phone. All the services that you can get globally, it's about $200–300 billion of additional revenue. Really, you can make money. Second, electrification. We will have 300 new electrified vehicles coming out until 2020. So there's no question anymore that we will have electrified vehicles. To be quite honest, the automotive industry 3 to 5 years ago was still discussing it. Shared mobility. Just in the US, you have 30 billion of investment in ride sharing. Never seen before this amount of money, 30 billion. And people are using it. It's growing by 20–25% every year. It makes a lot of sense that you not own the vehicle, but you own the right. So a temporary ownership. And then the autonomy, very important. People talk about L5 autonomy, which is far out. L4 autonomy in a little bit kind of controlled area can cover about 70% of the US, therefore very similar numbers probably in other areas. This is about 2 to 3 years away. So therefore, all of this is kind of 2 to 3 years away and is therefore reality. What I'd like to conclude is, while most people agree that this is like the system, I think it's important this system will be healthier, more convenient, safer, greener, less expensive. So the outlook is beautiful. The transition is actually what we need to talk about. The transition is actually difficult. Thank you very much.
Спасибо, Stefan, за...
Thank you, Stefan, for a very interesting document that you demonstrated to us. I would like to set the tune for future questions to you as a person who is very well familiar with the automotive industry. Quite recently, the new mayor of London published his transportation strategy, where he identified several ambitious targets for his administration. I would like to quote some of his statements: to reduce the use of cars so that by 2041, 80% of movement in London will be on foot, on bicycle, or on municipal transport. To what extent, it's my next question now is, to what extent you believe these targets set by the mayor of London are feasible for large cities, metropolitan areas like London, bigger London or Moscow, and other similar cities? To what extent you should set this target, a reduction of movement in any kinds of privately owned transportation with a focus on bicycles and municipal transports and walking? We're joined by Jessica with her daughter, likely. Jessica, if it is convenient for you, we would like to ask you about the experience that you have and your knowledge in terms of transition to sustainable transportation policies in cities.
Good morning, everybody. Sorry if there were...
I can repeat, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah? Done.
Oh, no, it's okay. You don't have
it's
to.
okay.
But I'll just do some intro remarks, and that's okay. But good morning, everybody. So sorry that you had to wait for me. There was technical difficulties with getting in this morning. But yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some ideas in sustainable transportation. This morning I have a small guest accompanying me. So it's very exciting to be here in Moscow with everybody. And also I want to thank all the organizers for being so flexible and accommodating and working so hard. So I am from New York City, and I teach courses at New York University's School of Professional Studies at the Center for Global Affairs. And I develop and teach courses about sustainable urbanization and food policy, actually, and also transportation. And I've spent many years working locally in New York City for the city government, and also I've worked internationally at the World Bank and urban development in Latin America. So I've lived in a bunch of cities around the world, in London and Washington and Barcelona and in Oregon, but I was born in New York City, and while I am really inspired by many other cities, my heart's really in New York, and I really love the energy and sort of disorder and order of the city, and I think from an early age, I set out exploring New York on foot. And for me and many others, the pace and scale and vibrancy of New York and many other cities is best experienced on foot. And as I think many of us are realizing now, as we're all working on and thinking about the long-term sustainable development of our cities, that aside from being very enjoyable, walking and cycling through our cities is actually really the most sustainable way for us to move ourselves through them. And this really must be done in partnership with a really robust public transportation system. So in my mind, the best way for cities to encourage walking and cycling, which also, aside from being the most sustainable in terms of carbon emissions, are also the most sustainable in terms of public health. And the best way to promote this is really by making our streets safe for pedestrians and cyclists, which also makes the streets safer for motorists as well. So I think these safe spaces create not only really vibrant city life, but also encourage more generally sustainable lifestyles as well. So So as we've seen in New York, so many of New York City's streets were transformed under the Bloomberg administration, and then again during the current mayoral administration, there has really been a really strong focus on traffic safety, and that's really helped maintain maintain the sustainable transportation system that we have. And so just while working on these issues and also while working in the World Bank, I noticed sort of some guidelines in creating a sustainable transportation system. And I think it's that these are most effectively done through kind of a multi-pronged approach. So it's important to have these policy changes that create changes in the city's streets, such as physical construction and interventions in the actual streets, including pedestrian plazas or more space on the sidewalk for people to walk, bike lanes, but also that has to be accompanied by a public policy and public education campaign so that the population knows why these changes are happening. And I think it's important to remember that change is hard, and change is always hard for people to understand and to do. So having a communication process to help guide people through this is usually really helpful. And also usually partnering with an enforcement organization in New York, the Department of Transportation partners with the police department to make sure that the work that's being done is enforced so that people start to learn the change and follow the rules, and this is helpful. But so, and then also I wanted to point out that forums like this are really important because I think there's a lot of inspiration that can be learned between cities. And I think it doesn't matter if the city is a city in a developing country or a city in a more developed country or a city in the old Europe or the new world or either way, but I think that there's really a great opportunity to learn and implement programs and projects from cities in other cities. And this, and the good example of this was that New York has been really inspired by Jan Gehl's work in Copenhagen, and a lot of his work there was sort of adopted and adapted in New York City streets. But also the bus rapid transit programs from Latin America were sort of inspired New York City as well, and now we have these fast bus lanes for buses around the city. So I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation and learning from other cities and sharing experiences.
Спасибо большое, Джессика, за то, что вы рассказали про.
Thank you, Jessica, for sharing your experience in New York. My proposal was that after each, let's say, contribution of each of the speakers, when each of the speakers would share his or her views and experience, I, as a moderator, I would ask a question which I would like you to ask in the second part of our discussion. For you, my question is, New York is a huge city, comparable to any big city in the world, well, including Moscow. My question is, how you convince the population of a big city to use more municipal transport or alternative ways of transit like walking or bicycling, and to less rely on privately owned vehicles? There are two options that I see: by introducing certain restrictions, knowing that in New York people discuss the paid entry to the Manhattan area. Maybe my information is outdated, but when I was prepared for this meeting, I learned something about that. Or by using a method of huge awareness campaigns where you talk about healthy lifestyle, about the damage which privately owned cars inflict. What you look for: impose tougher restriction measures, or by providing new knowledge about the harmful effect of privately owned cars and of the benefits of alternative ways of movement? Well, in your opinion, where should we move, and what will be your advice to Moscow? As for the second part of our discussion, I would like to give the floor to Igor Antarov, managing partner of Moscow Tesla Cup. It's not a question, it's just like a statement which I would like you to comment on. Statistics says that the share of sales of electricity cars amounts to about 1%, or even under 1% of the total car sales globally. You, as a representative of electricity cars division, what do you believe should be done by us as city administrators, city managers, to ensure bigger sales of electricity-driven cars? Or you expect some technology breakthroughs which will make e-cars more available for everyone?
Thank you so much. Thank you for your kind attention. I would like to take the clicker first.
Sorry.
Indeed, if we speak about the EVs, they might seem to be our future and something unusual and strange. And the question arises, are they really useful and beneficial for the environment of the urban areas? But we may see how to apply them in the medical sphere, in transport, just saving money, and actually taking care of the entire safety of the population, and to what extent it is an efficient one, whether it's a rapid one, and whether it has the future. I have some slides about showing New York of 1900. Just try to find a car. Yes, here. It's just the only one. And so people had to anticipate it. And it's 1913. We cannot find too many horses there, but these are actually cars. So 13 years later, it all happened. And could people believe to what extent the automotive vehicles might change? And they actually could never imagine things like that. And so how do we extrapolate it to our actual reality? And I would like to cite some statistics as to what we have in various countries of the world. And Germany or China present their own statistics, and even Norway, and their charts show exponential growth of the EV application. And for me, these are those S-curves, technological curves, like mobile phones. On the start, they were just standalone items and very expensive. And out of the blue, it happened so that every child has a telephone. And I should say that electric cars will gain the same popularity. Everyone will be driving it. And what should be the examples to cite? Why do we need electric cars, and why is it so substantial for us all? Let's have a look at the supercharger stations availability, and it's kind of an exemplary fact. Tesla has a very dense network for superchargers in Europe. And we also have Ionity, and they have 400 more superchargers. And this is the map of Europe as to the density of this network for superchargers. And if we have a look at the European part of Russia, we see it like this. And so we really pose a problem. And if we want to catch up and to be a part of this train and not to have a worse ecology, so we have to get rid of the diesel or petrol engines and use electric cars. And let's start from the cities and towns. We start from mega cities, First, actually, that's how Moscow looks like as to the availability of superchargers, and that was all due to the initiative of the expert group under the government of Moscow. We have the projects in the Moscow Oblast. We have quite a number of superchargers, and actually we can use any kind of a pole for electric light, and really we may organize this infrastructural project in the right direction. And summing up, let me emphasize what needs to be done to make a progress. First of all, there should be the support of the government provided. It's the key initial factor. From the perspective of infrastructure, we have to take care of parking lots, cafes, and superchargers, and also the highways should be fully equipped with the superchargers. And awareness and providing information. Not everybody understands what it is all about if we speak about the EV. And sometimes we have to give the T-shirts of that sort as a gift to the owners of electric cars. And what needs to be done by the government using the best practices at the global level and expertise? It all starts from cities and towns, and it all starts from the access to the priority transport, to the dedicated lanes, and that will allow the general public to start pondering it out, that electric cars are really great. And by the way, some countries even decided to abolish certain taxes and abolish certain certification procedures for the electric cars. And it incentivized the process of electric cars' growth in these countries. And probably VAT and duties should not be imposed. But once we reach the turning point, we may also abolish other measures and introduce new ones. And the government will just gain other than have some opposite effects, and we will have a higher and a better quality environment and quite a number of other benefits. Thank you, Igor. I would like to ask two questions to you. What is the problem so far? And we knew how it all happened with cell phones. But the companies to produce electric cars use various types of superchargers, and that's a real problem. And if we take the experience of past years, so far we haven't yet addressed this challenge. And when we started selecting the superchargers for Moscow, it all happened that Tesla uses its own technology. The Japanese companies prefer their own technologies. They somehow negotiated on that score, but not 100%. And Europeans also have their own modifications of superchargers. It's kind of an unusual story to me. But Tesla company is a standalone company. They use their own technology for supercharging. And so the question arises whether all these facilities will become uniform and universal, and whether they might negotiate. And when we see the producers, the manufacturers of electric cars, what happens then at these meetings? These are meetings under the closed doors. And you, as the administration of cities and towns, should not allow these cars to go to green areas or central areas. And actually, the access should not be given to the. There should be the access given to electric cars rather than to diesel and gasoline cars. And you Are you a proponent on some prohibiting measures? For example, the garden ring of Moscow. The garden ring of Moscow may only have electric cars available. And what do you think about it? And not always. The car manufacturers do not like to discuss it. But when they get together with the city administration, they prefer these discussions as well. Okay. And I wanted to ask Salvador, the director of the Agency for Urban Technologies of Barcelona, to have a say. For me, Barcelona is one of the most beautiful city of the world, and you showed some exemplary initiatives in order to make the life comfortable in Barcelona. So, Salvador, will you please share your expertise with us?
Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation. My presentation is around of a new urban cell named Superblocks. Is into of the new urban mobility plan of Barcelona approved in 2015. At the beginning, we have in Barcelona 85% of the public space involved in mobility. Practically all of our public space, similar in Moscow, in New York, and in all the cities. If we want to reduce and to go to the zero emissions, we need to change the mobility model. If not, it's not possible. For this, I'm working in this idea for 30 years. This is the Superblock. In the left, we have the current situation, and on the right, we have a Superblock. Vehicles go, the transit go for the periferia in black in this scheme. And inside, it's impossible to cross, to go through with car. You can go in, but with a slope, go out in the same street, okay? Then it's silly to go in if your destination is not inside in the Superblock. Then you reduce the 99% of cars inside of the Superblocks. On the other hand, inside it's possible to go in both directions, in bicycle and pedestrians, and walking. And the speed inside is 10 kilometers per hour, because we want to change the uses, the functions inside of the Superblock. And at the end, we liberate, in the case of Barcelona, the 70% of the public space today related with the mobility. Okay? This is the question. If we want to obtain this scenario approved in 2015 in Barcelona, if we want to arrive at this scenario, and at the same time we want to have the same level of service in traffic, it means the speed in these red lines, the speed will be the same that in the current situation. We need to reduce only 13% of cars. With 13% the cars less, we obtain a liberation of 70% of public space. And this is the map representative of the pedestrian areas in Barcelona today. About 15% of the public space is with a unique section in the streets. With the Superblocks, this is the newest scenario. it means more than 6 million of square meters liberated of cars, only with 13% of carless. And in that case, our intention is not only to the destination of the functions inside of this public space is not only for pedestrian. The pedestrian is a mode of transport. We want to change our brain and to be citizens, not only pedestrians. And the citizen is a people, a person, a people who can develop different functions and uses of the public space. In the left scheme, we have only mobility is the current situation. In the right scheme, we can develop the interchange rights, the leisure, the culture, even the participation, and naturally, movement, above all, with walking movements. Okay? This is the most radical idea. We need to change from pedestrians to citizens. Okay? With this approach, we can reduce more than 4 times reducing the energy with this proposed. And in this case, the Superblock is not only the base of the mobility model, is also the base of the urbanism model. And for this, we are developed a new charter to design new developments and also to regenerate the existing ones. This charter you can load in this web, okay? Is in Russian also translated. After that, we want to change the cities, not only for functionality, not only for mobility or the public space. We want to change all of our cities because it's originally. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, Сальвадор, за ваш интересный рассказ.
Thank you, Salvador, for your very interesting presentation. I would like to ask you the following question. We're running out of time. We've got about a quarter of an hour left. You know that in Moscow, the seasons are well marked, well pronounced. It's pretty cold in winter, and in summer it may be comfortable. Yesterday it was pretty hot, today it's quite nice. Based on your experience in Barcelona, we have some ideas proposed by experts. They suggest to block some of the city streets, both in summer and in winter, on some days, to give them totally at the disposal of pedestrians and forbid any car movement. Some people propose to do it on weekdays or on the weekends. What is your attitude towards that? How do you recommend it? How the streets should be filled in? Not only banned for cars, but what other content you should include there? How to adapt it to Moscow? That's my question. If you don't mind, I identified some of the questions to which I would like you to provide answers. If you don't mind, we have very little time left. Victoria, could you answer the question that I outlined? I remember you asked about an ideal city and the system of measures for Moscow. Not to waste our time, I would say that an ideal city is a sort of philosophical concept. To me, as a practitioner, I do not give it a lot of thought because I'm used to making calculations and designing something. If we talk about an ideal city, we talk largely some objective content, some balanced, optimal city. This is how I see it. And a sort of ideal space which citizens may have in their minds. As for the inhabitants of the city, they are very specific in perceiving their own city and will never arrive to an ideal situation, even if they look at transport. Our recent survey demonstrated that people do not see transport on such scale as experts see it. Only 60% of surveyed population put it, well, number one, only 60%. But the industries see the transport situation as number one, that's 40% of that. Talking briefly, a search for an optimal balanced city, it's a total of ideal districts of the city. For the downtown area, it's one thing. For outskirts of the city, it's another thing. For New Moscow, it's a totally new challenge for the transportation system. And there could not be a single ideal city. As for measures which are appropriate for Moscow, a big set of measures include technology like electricity-driven cars, a variety of tax benefits, etc., to encourage some areas, social psychology that's educating car drivers, planning groups, which I discussed, a group of measures using the underground space, subsurface space, which may also dramatically improve the situation. But I'm driving to the following. That group of measures that is related to planning structures, to transport specialists. Ecology is a double effect. That's a pleasant bonus to city, to proper planning of transportation network. It will reduce the exhaust gases just by improving their road network. If the transport policy is okay, environmental benefits will be always a bonus. In Moscow, about 930,000 million tons of exhaust. It's a huge figure. Is there any measure that could dramatically reduce such emissions? There is not such single measure. The answer to the question is very straightforward. We should do everything. We should take care of all aspects. When we reconstruct our roads, we reduce emissions by a certain factor. When we offer cycling pathways, we reduce emissions even further. And I will very cautiously treat any bans and prohibitions, because as a rule, bans and prohibitions do not always yield a good result. Seemingly, if we ban everything will be okay, but the system is so complex, it's self-regulating, that free development may be a better option. Thank you very much, Victoria. It's quite clear. Stefan, what's yours? Would you comment on what is going on in London and your take on that?
Yeah, very quickly. I know we're running out of time. Let me answer this in two ways. So, number one, I congratulate London for having a very concrete strategy. The reason I'm saying this, as we speak right now, for the Moscow Urban Forum, we are releasing a report that is based on the benchmarking transportation system, and we kind of benchmark 25 global mega cities. One of the findings is that cities that have a very clear strategy are performing better. The second finding is if the city has a very clear strategy and then very quickly acts on it, that the people living in the city react very positively about it. So therefore, having a strategy, acting actually very powerfully on those strategy, gets you to positive reactions there. The second thing is very specifically to London, kind of 80% by foot, in 2040 by foot, by bicycle, municipal transportation. I'm obviously a big fan of walking, of bicycle, all those different things. However, I do believe that the solution might be a little bit more complicated because every city has different solutions. We heard terrific examples from Barcelona. Obviously, in Moscow, you have made actually significant progress, amazing things that happen in New York City. So I think the starting point of every city is different. And therefore, as I said, the combination of different solutions, figuring out what's the starting point, what's the end point, what are the things that actually, on a focused acceleration, as I described earlier, is the right thing to do for the city. I think that's how I would go about it.
Спасибо, Stefan. Jessica, если...
Thank you, Stefan. Now, Jessica, if possible, what may happen with you? Are there restrictions or a promotion and awareness campaign which is more appropriate? And what New York is preparing for the near-term future?
Yes, well, you brought up a number of interesting points. So I think, and part of what I also wanted to talk about was that cities, in addition to creating safe public spaces for pedestrians and cyclists, also need to be kind of nimble and accept new changing ways of electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles that are sort of inevitably the future, and keep in mind the need for infrastructure for that. But you brought up a really interesting and important and controversial point about congestion pricing, and this has sort of been on the agenda and off the legislative agenda for years and years. And I think that the real issue is kind of competing priorities, because the congestion pricing, I think, most certainly would take a lot of the city's traffic off the streets. But in addition to that, there's concern that it would hurt, that it would disproportionately hurt lower-income people. So there is this sort of political competition and priorities, and it depends which elected official has sort of the stomach or prioritizes the environment over, equity, and so it's very complicated. But so I'm not sure what will happen on that front, but or if there is some way to structure it so it doesn't hurt people. But also I think really fortifying the subway system and making it stronger and more efficient, which is I think in a work in progress. But I think that's another important element in taking people out of taxis and out of Ubers and out of their own personal cars and back into the public transportation system.
Спасибо, Jessica, за ваш...
Thank you, Jessica, for your answer. Igor, very briefly, organizers say that we're running out of time. Could you answer this very brief question? Where we're running out of time?
Yes, Superchargers. Yes, it's as simple as that. I should say that there will be a European standard, and everyone will comply with that standard. There's no other way. Some prohibiting measures. First and foremost, we should give an alternative to the users, less costly electric car. If we need an alternative, this alternative may be of great interest to the general public. And if we have duties imposed, just abandoned, as well as other measures, so they should be located in the right places, and the users of standard cars will see that those parking lots are available, and these lots may be aptly used, and there will be no problem with that. Further, I may put my electric cars to the parking lot absolutely free of charge, even in the Sheremetyevo airport. And if people knew about that, so they'll probably get transferred to these electric cars, having at least the parking lots priority being free for them. Maybe we just discuss the development of electric transport in Moscow. If you have any available issues to discuss, so you're welcome. Salvador, the floor is yours.
Okay. Moscow, like London or Barcelona or New York, have people, cars, buildings, streets, and the blocks are similar in all the cases. Then the solutions is possible to implement it in the same way. Then in my opinion, or my proposal, would be first to create the alternative of the cars. For create the alternative of the cars, we need rethinking our public transport networks, even the cycle networks is the first. When you have the alternative, you can develop the restrictions for the cars. Because it's very important, the emissions in the atmosphere across the cars. But the main limiting factor is the occupation of the public space for the cars. This is because it's limited. Then my proposal is include one tool, perhaps the most important tool, the most sensible organ in the human beings is our pocket. This is the key. It means that you need to increase the price of the parkings or develop some solutions like the congestion charge, like in London or Stockholm. But at the end, is the price, is the money, because our economic conscience is higher than our ecological conscience. Okay? Then three things, and after that, we need a technical solutions. And the Superblock is the most efficient solution because with a limited reduction of cars, we obtain the maximum liberation of the public space. And for Moscow, it's perfectly and ideal to develop.
Спасибо большое, Сальвадор. Спасибо большое.
Thank you, Salvador. Thank you for your contribution onto the deliberations of our sections. Goodbye.